The prominent 19th century German Jewish painter, Moritz Daniel Oppenheim, lived in Rome for a few years in his 20s. And one day he entered a Jewish home in the Rome ghetto. In panic, the women quickly gathered all the children and hid them out of sight. Calm was only restored when Oppenheim assured them that he was Jewish. But the Roman Jewish mothers had every reason to panic. Rome had a sorry history of Catholic attempts to forcibly baptize Jewish children. Just a few decades earlier, in 1783, Roman police removed 2 Jewish children from the ghetto for forcible baptism at the request of a convert cousin of the children's father. So they didn't need much excuse to be doing this. And when the Jews protested, 60 Jews were thrown into prison until the community ransomed them. In Ferrara, a couple of years later, 1785, Regina Bianchini, the 23-year-old pregnant wife of one of the city's most influential Jewish citizens, was taken to the Archbishop's palace against her will. Why? Because 20 years earlier, her 6-year-old Christian playmate, Francesca, had splashed water on the 3-year-old Regina, lisping what she believed to be the baptismal formula. And for that, Regina was imprisoned for several days before being released. 40 years after Oppenheim's experience in the Rome ghetto, a major abduction scandal involving a Jewish child in Bologna prompted Oppenheim to paint an emotional scene set in Italy that depicted a beatific young Jewish boy surrounded by Catholic clergy with the child's mother in a faint. This afternoon we will explore the background to this abduction. In 16th century Rome, Ignatius Loyola, some of you may have heard of him, decided that the Jews were not converting in large enough numbers. He founded the house of, and I hope I'm going to pronounce this right, catechumens?
Catechumen.
Sorry?
Catechumen.
Oh, catechumen, thank you so much. He founded the house, it's spelled C-H, you see. He founded the house of catechumens, a place where Jews could undergo conversion to Christianity on a fast track. Loyola's famous phrase, "Give me a child until he is 7 and I will give you the man," is very pertinent to our subject today. The Pope at the time, Paul IV, was also impatient with those stubborn Jews. "Our tolerance has reached its limits," he declared, "so we will shut the ungrateful Jews living in our midst into ghettos." Jews were forced to wear yellow badges. Rabbis had to parade around in funny outfits during Holy Week so that Christians could throw rotten tomatoes at them. Fast forward to the mid-19th century Italy, a patchwork of kingdoms, duchies, and principalities. The Pope was the authoritarian ruler of the Papal States that extended from Rome to Ferrara, including the city of Bologna. By the time Salomone Momolo was his Solomon Momolo, Mortara, and his wife Mariana arrived in the city in 1850, there was a Jewish community of about 200. The Jews practiced their Judaism discreetly. There was neither a rabbi nor a synagogue. Officially, since the 16th century, in other words, for the previous 1500 years, it was forbidden for Jews to employ Christian servants. In practice, however, most observant Jewish families, like the Mortaras, kept Catholic maids who proved particularly useful as Shabbos goys, in other words, a Gentile who could turn lights on or light fires or whatever on the Sabbath. August the 27th, 1851, 1 year after arriving in Bologna, Mariana Mortara gave birth to her sixth child, Edgardo Levi. The family engaged Anna Nina Morisi, an illiterate teenage Catholic girl from a nearby village, to look after the children. In early 1855, Morisi became pregnant, a not uncommon occurrence among unmarried servants in Bologna at this time. In these circumstances, many families simply sacked the girls, not the Mortaras. They paid for Morisi to spend the last 4 months of her pregnancy at a midwife's home. She gave birth and handed her baby over to an orphanage as dictated by the Papal States. She returned to work with the Mortaras until 1857, when she went to work for another Bologna family, and soon after that she got married and moved back to her village. Morisi may have been grateful to the Mortaras for their kindness, but if she was, she showed it in a very strange manner. She may have been illiterate, but she knew that although Catholics were not allowed to baptize Jewish children without the parents' consent, emergency baptism was permissible if a child was mortally ill. Soon after she was employed by the Mortaras, Morisi told a local grocer that she believed that the infant Edgardo was on the brink of death. After the grocer showed Morisi how to perform baptism, she sprinkled water on the boy's head, saying, "I baptize you in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost." Morisi told no one, and young Edgardo made a full recovery. When Edgardo's 1-year-old younger brother, Aristide, died in 1857, a neighbor's servant told Morisi that she should have baptized the child. And despite the noble way the Mortaras had treated her, Morisi broke her silence and told the neighbor's servant girl about her clandestine baptism of Edgardo. And it was this revelation that reached the ears of a Dominican friar called Father Pier Felletti. He was Bologna's inquisitor, responsible for ensuring that restrictions on the Jews were obeyed. And with the authority of the supreme sacred congregation of the Roman and Universal Inquisition, known to us as the Holy Office, responsible for defending Catholic doctrine, Felletti interrogated Morisi. And after deciding that saving the child's soul outweighed the Church's customary deferment to parental authority, Felletti had Morisi swear to keep the story quiet and sent a transcript of the meeting to Rome. There was a sick logic to Felletti's decision that Edgardo was a Catholic, because not only were Jews not allowed to have Catholic maids, but a Jew could not raise a Catholic child. So if Edgardo was a baptized Catholic, his Jewish parents couldn't raise him. Felletti therefore ordered that Edgardo be forcibly removed from his non-Christian parents in order that he should be raised by the Church. And on the evening of the 23rd of June, 1858, a detail of papal military police arrived at the Mortara apartment and explained that they were under orders from Felletti to remove 7-year-old Edgardo from the family home. Mariana screamed hysterically, ran to Edgardo's bed, and shrieked that they would have to kill her before taking him. Mariana's uncle and brother-in-law, prominent members of Bologna's Jewish community, secured an emergency audience that night with Felletti. He claimed he was merely following orders. That desperate phrase of the... Naturally, he did not divulge that Morisi... He agreed that Edgardo could spend one more night at home, but stationed police in the apartment in case the family had the child killed. The Mortara spent the next day desperately trying to have Felletti's order overruled, and at 5 p.m. Momolo himself made another direct appeal to Felletti. The inquisitor told Momolo not to worry, Edgardo would be well cared for under the protection of the Pope himself. Momolo sent his family out of the home and was alone with Edgardo when the police came back at 8 p.m. The police, in tears, took Edgardo from his father's arms. Momolo followed the police down the stairs into the street and fainted. It took days for the family to discover that Edgardo had been taken to Rome, to the house of catechumens.
Catechumen.
Right, catechumen. The S is obviously silent. That was founded by Loyola. Supported by the Jewish communities in Bologna, Rome, and elsewhere in Italy, Momolo tried to rally support from Jews abroad. The initial response of the papal government was to simply ignore Momolo's appeals. But in the non-Catholic press, there was a backlash against what was seen as papal tyranny. The idea that a sovereign state in Europe could snatch a child from its home for the sole reason that its parents did not profess the state religion was repugnant to 19th century liberal ideals. This negative publicity forced Cardinal Antonelli, the Pope's Secretary of State, to meet Momolo in early August 1858. Antonelli promised to refer the matter to the Pope, and he also allowed Momolo visitation rights. The real tragedy of the Edgardo Mortara abduction scandal is that two rival and incompatible narratives now emerged. According to the family, when Momolo visited his 7-year-old son under the supervision of the rector of the catechumen between mid-August and mid-September 1858, he learned that the helpless Edgardo had spent the journey to Rome crying for his parents and wanted nothing more to return home. Not unexpectedly, the Catholic narrative was very different. According to the policeman who escorted Edgardo to Rome, the boy had at first stubbornly refused to enter a church with him for Mass, but later displayed an apparent miraculous transformation. Portraying Edgardo as a kind of prodigy, the Catholic La Monia della Religione con la Civiltà, I hope I pronounced that correctly, reported that he had learnt the catechism perfectly within a few days, had blessed the servant who baptized him, and that the 7-year-old had declared that he wanted to convert all Jews to Christianity. In this version of the story, Edgardo undergoes a divinely ordained, soul-stirring redemption and is endowed with spiritual strength far beyond his years. He was 7. After facing a life of error which would be followed by eternal damnation, Edgardo now stood to share in Christian salvation. And Edgardo was quoted as saying, I am baptized, and my father is the Pope. The views of liberals, Protestants, and Jews across the continent were summed up in a booklet published in Brussels, and I quote, between the miracle of a 6-year-old apostle who wants to convert the Jews and the cry of a child who keeps asking for his mother and his little sisters, we don't hesitate for a moment. October 1858, Momolo took Mariana with him to Rome to try and influence the church and Edgardo. To prevent Edgardo encountering his parents, the rector of the catechumen moved Edgardo 100 kilometers away to Alatri. The intrepid Momolo tracked them down to a church in Alatri where a priest was saying Mass, assisted by Edgardo. As Momolo and Mariana waited for the service to finish, the mayor of Alatri had the Mortaras arrested on the order of the town's bishop. Cardinal Antonelli intervened and ordered that Edgardo be returned to Rome. And Momolo and Mariana were allowed to visit him between late October and late November 1858. And once again, we have two competing narratives. The Mortaras claim that Edgardo was obviously intimidated by the clergymen around him and threw himself into his mother's arms when he first saw her. Mariana said, "He'd lost weight and had turned pale, his eyes were filled with terror. I told him he was born a Jew like us, and like us he must always remain one, and he replied, Si, mia cara mama, I will never forget to say the Shema prayer every day." The Catholic narrative described a boy resolved to become a Catholic, horrified by his mother's exhortations to return to the Judaism of his ancestors. In the meantime, there were international protests demanding that the Pope return Edgardo to his parents. The Edgardo case was now a cause célèbre in both Europe and the United States. The New York Times devoted more than 20 articles to this story in December 1858 alone. In Britain, The Spectator presented the Mortara case as evidence that the Papal States had, I quote, "the worst government in the world, the most insolvent and the most arrogant, the cruelest and the meanest." Well, The Spectator would say that. With the support of the anti-Semitic Catholic press, the Pope would not be moved. Predictably, one Catholic newspaper claimed that the critical coverage in Britain, France and Germany was due to the fact that, I quote, "currently the newspapers of Europe are in good part in the hands of the Jews." And where have we heard that before? To combat the international outcry, the Catholic Church's Dirty Tricks Department tried to frame the Jews of the Roman ghetto by hiding some Christian children in a synagogue so that the Jews could be accused of kidnapping them for ritual slaughter. The plot was thwarted. German rabbis sent a petition to the Pope. British Jews held a mass meeting. Catholic sovereigns such as Francis Joseph of Austria, Napoleon III of France, wrote personal letters to the Pope advising him not to defy the public opinion of Europe. Some of you might remember that in my talk on blood libels last year, I mentioned that Sir Moses Montefiore, the president of the Board of Deputies of British Jews, travelled to Damascus in 1840 to diffuse the Damascus blood libel. As soon as the Mortara scandal erupted, the same Sir Moses Montefiore tried to persuade the British government to lodge an official protest with the Pope. And when the British government refused, Montefiore travelled to Rome to personally present a petition to the Pope. He met with Cardinal Antonelli and asked him to pass on the Board of Deputies' petition to the Pope. While Montefiore was waiting for a response, news reached Rome that fighting had broken out between Austrian and Piedmontese troops in the north, and the War of 1859 had begun. And while most foreign dignitaries fled Rome, Montefiore waited in vain for the Pope's response, finally leaving empty-handed. On his return to Britain, more than 2,000 leading citizens, including 79 mayors, 27 peers, 22 Anglican bishops and archbishops, and 36 members of parliament, signed a protest calling the Pope's conduct a dishonour to Christianity and repulsive to the instincts of humanity. But far from calming the situation, the defiant Pope proclaimed that returning the baptized Edgardo to his non-Christian family was totally incompatible with church doctrine. For many years, there'd been a custom that a delegation from Rome's Jewish community had an annual audience with the Pope. The February 1859 audience quickly descended into a heated argument, with Pius berating the Jewish visitors for stirring up a storm all over Europe about this Mortara case. 2 years later, in January 1861, the Pope went one better. The Jewish visitors were confronted by a highly provocative vista, standing at the pontiff's side was 10-year-old Edgardo Mortara. Some historians claim that the fallout from the Mortara scandal persuaded Napoleon III of France to change his policy and to support a unified Italy. And in June 1859, the papal colours flying in the squares of Bologna were replaced with the Italian green, white and red. The cardinal legate had left the city and Bologna was incorporated as part of the province of Romagna. One of the new regime's first official acts was to introduce freedom of religion. And in November 1859, the new governor, issued a proclamation abolishing the Inquisition and ordering an inquiry into the, I quote, authors of the Mortara kidnapping. On July the 2nd, 1860, Filetti, the inquisitor, who had sent the police to abduct Edgardo, was arrested. He refused to appoint a defense counsel, saying he was putting his defense in the hands of God and the Virgin Mary. None of the Mortaras attended the hearing before a panel of 6 judges on the 16th of April 1860 because they'd moved to Turin in the meantime and they heard about the trial too late. Through his court-appointed defense lawyer, Filetti insisted he had only carried out orders. He said, "I am obliged to explain myself to one forum only, to the Supreme Sacred Congregation in Rome, whose prefect is His Holiness Pope Pius, and to no one else." He said that Edgardo had always remained firm in his desire to remain a Christian and was now studying successfully in Rome. He even predicted that Edgardo would one day be the support and pride of the Mortara family. When Filetti was ordered to hand over all the files relating to the Mortara case, he claimed that they had been burned. Shades of the destroyed evidence in our own failed Sean Fitzpatrick case, I suspect. The prosecutor claimed that Filetti had ordered the kidnapping out of megalomania and an inquisitor's hatred of Judaism. Yet despite all the evidence, the judging panel ruled that Filetti should indeed be released, on the grounds that he had acted under instructions from the government, the papal government we're talking about, of the time. Many people believed that the authorities should never have targeted Filetti because he was too low on the totem pole. In France, Archiv Israélite asked, "What good does it do to strike at the arm when it is the head that in this case conceived, carried out and sanctioned the attack?" One direct consequence of the Edgardo scandal was the formation in May 1860 of the Alliance Israélite Universelle, a Paris-based self-defense organization, the first Jewish self-defense organization in the world, dedicated to the advancement of Jewish civil rights across the world. Filetti's staunch refusal to recognize the court was rewarded when his Dominican superiors and the Pope made him prior of a convent in Rome. In the Bible, we read that Pharaoh's heart was hardened against the Israelites. Well, so it was with the Pope. His heart was further hardened. In 1864, he published the Syllabus of Errors, which condemned freedom of religion, stated that non-Catholics could not be saved, and attacked the progress, liberalism, and modern civilization. As if to prove a point, the Church was implicated that same year in another episode involving an abducted Jewish boy. 9-year-old Giuseppe Cohen lived in Rome's ghetto. One day he failed to return home from his job at a nearby cobbler's shop. His parents soon discovered he'd been forcibly removed from the cobbler's shop and taken to the house of a catechumen, that same place where Edgardo Mortara had been taken after his abduction. and the Cohen case looked like a repeat of the Mortara drama. When protests grew, the Catholic press argued that young Giuseppe had long nourished the wish to become a Christian. I quote, "For 15 days he begged his employer to take him to the house of the catechumen." Giuseppe's parents knew from the Mortara case that simply petitioning the church would achieve nothing. The family galvanized international support, and the French ambassador went to see Cardinal Antonelli on the family's behalf. The ambassador returned to the Vatican the following morning to renew his angry protests, but to no avail. The French liberal press demanded to know why French soldiers were standing by while Jewish children were being stolen from their parents. The Giuseppe Cohen battle continued for several years. He was finally restored to his family only after a court decided that as he was not yet an adult, he was 16 at this point, his father still held legal rights over him. This did not prevent Giuseppe from returning to Rome as soon as he could, and he became a priest. Meanwhile, something similar was happening with Edgardo Mortara. In 1865, the year that Edgardo should have celebrated his bar mitzvah, the 13-year-old decided to devote his life to the church and became a novice. He added the Pope's name to his own to become Pio Edgardo Mortara. In May 1867, his parents, who are now living in Florence, wrote that they still loved him dearly but saw nothing of their son in the letters they had received from him. When Italian troops captured Rome in September 1870, Momolo saw an opportunity to finally reclaim his son. Edgardo had other ideas. Fearing that he was about to be kidnapped by the Jews, Edgardo had himself smuggled out of Rome by train late at night in lay clothes. He found shelter in an Austrian convent where he lived under an assumed name. In 1872, he moved to a monastery in France where Pope Pius regularly corresponded with the bishop about the young man. In 1873, Pio Edgardo Mortara was ordained as a priest with special dispensation, as at 21 he was technically too young. Father Mortara spent most of the rest of his life outside Italy, traveling throughout Europe and preaching. Momolo Mortara died in 1871 and was thus spared the trauma of knowing the ultimate fate of his abducted son. In 1878, Mariana traveled to southwestern France, where she'd heard Edgardo was preaching and enjoyed an emotional reunion with her son. He was pleased to see her, but disappointed when she refused his pleas to convert to Catholicism. And following Mariana's death in 1890, some French newspapers gleefully reported that she had finally, on her deathbed and with Edgardo beside her, become a Christian. Edgardo himself refuted this. "I've always ardently desired that my mother embrace the Catholic faith, he wrote in a letter to Le Temps, and I tried many times to get her to do so. However, that never happened." In my last talk, I pointed out that de Valera's infamous condolence visit to the German legation after Hitler committed suicide in 1945 is well known to Jews, but relatively unknown to the Irish public. When in the 1990s David Kurtzer began studying the Mortara case, he was surprised to find that while specialists in Jewish studies across the world had invariably heard of the abduction scandal, many of his Italian colleagues had not. As Kurtzer put it, Mortara had fallen from the mainstream of Italian history into the ghetto of Jewish history. Kurtz's 1997 book, The Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara, is still the standard reference for the affair. And this book is the source for the forthcoming movie on the Mortara abduction, directed by Steven Spielberg, and that's meant to be coming out next year in 2018. According to historian Timothy Verhoeven, the Mortara case was the greatest controversy to surround the Catholic Church in the mid-19th century. Historian Abigail Green writes that this clash between liberal and Catholic worldviews at a moment of critical international tension gave the Mortara affair global significance and rendered it a transformative episode in the Jewish world as well. The Catholic Church likes to turn its popes into saints, and in the year 2000, Pius IX, the longest serving pope in history, from 1846 to 1878, the pope, of course, under whose jurisdiction the abduction took place, was a candidate for beatification by the Vatican. Jewish commentators and others in the international media raised the largely forgotten Mortara episode. Kurtzer even intervened with a bishop in charge of the Vatican's office of making saints. Of course, nothing helped, and Pius IX is now a saint. Kurtzer claimed that the Mortara case was a primary motivator for the French change of stance that precipitated Italian unification in 1859 to 1861. And he says, this story of an illiterate servant girl, a grocer, and a little Jewish child from Bologna may well have changed the course of both Italian and church history. We've looked at the facts of the case. We've looked at the rival narratives. And we know the end of the story. An abducted Jewish child goes on to become a Catholic priest. Was Edgardo brainwashed, or did he become a true believer at the age of 6? I'm not sure that anyone has a definitive answer. I have my own theory. Edgardo later wrote that the pontiff regularly spent time with him and played with him. Edgardo quotes the Pope, saying to him one day, "My son, you have cost me dearly, and I have suffered a great deal because of you." Edgardo claims that he wrote repeatedly to his family, I quote, "doing what I could to convince them of the truth of the Catholic faith." In his sermons, Edgardo was known for the inspirational way he was able to weave the remarkable story of his own childhood into his sermons. As he recounted it, God chose a simple, illiterate servant girl to invest the small child with the miraculous powers of divine grace, and in doing so rescued him from his Jewish family, good people, but as Jews on a God-forsaken path. And here is a remarkable statement from Edgardo. His abduction, he said, had been for a time more famous than that of the Sabine women. And for the uninitiated, the rape of the Sabine women was an incident from Roman mythology in which the men of Rome committed a mass abduction of young women from other cities in the region. Am I the only one who hears shades of John Lennon's controversial 1966 claim that the Beatles were more famous than Jesus? Am I the only one who wonders if this wasn't the case of the Stockholm Syndrome? Am I the only one who gets a sense that Edgardo might have quite enjoyed the controversy swirling around him? Am I the only one who feels that Edgardo may have loved being the Pope's favourite, the Pope's cause célèbre? And am I the only one who feels that Edgardo might have revelled in his notoriety as the victim of the most famous abduction story of the 19th century? I pose these as my thoughts after my research. Today we have explored a scandalous example of papal theological cruelty and arrogance towards Jews. We've seen a desperate attempt of the papacy to assert its declining power as secularism began to erode its authority. It was the 1850s equivalent of the sex scandals that have undermined the Pope's moral authority in our day. It was an early example of the Catholic Church protecting its own interests at the expense of human suffering, and of course just last week a new scandal erupted as the head of the Catholic Church in Australia, number 3 in the Vatican, is now is facing charges of sexual abuse. I want to offer 2 postscripts to the Edgardo Mortara scandal. My first postscript concerns Edgardo himself. He spent the last decades of his life at the Abbey of the Canons Regular at Bouhay in Liège, Belgium. And here lies the ultimate irony. He died in Belgium in 1940, just weeks before Nazi Germany invaded neutral Belgium. Had the Nazis got their hands on Edgardo, all his protestations that he was a Catholic priest would have been to no avail. With 2 Jewish parents, the Jewish-born Edgardo would have ended up in Auschwitz. Edgardo's Jewish family fled to Switzerland when Germany invaded Italy in 1943. Some of them managed to survive the Holocaust, others were not so lucky, and in a mirror image of things that happened in my own family, some of them were sent back to Italy by the good, neutral Swiss authorities and sent to Auschwitz where they were murdered. My second postscript brings us back to the artist Oppenheimer and his discovery that Italian Jews were terrified of their children being forcibly baptized. In 1862, when Oppenheimer heard of the Bologna scandal, he painted the Kidnapping of Edgardo Mortara. And although art experts knew of the existence of this painting, it went missing for the next 100 years. 1962, the painting caught the eye of a Catholic woman in Liverpool who'd come to an antique shop to look for a birthday present for her husband. And she forked out £100 for the painting, and it promptly dropped out of sight for another 50 years. 3 years ago, 150 years after Oppenheim painted the scene of Edgardo's abduction, the painting turned up at Sotheby's annual Judaica sale and fetched over $400,000. Thank you very much.